Good afternoon, everyone. We have currently got over 190 people signed in to watch this presentation this afternoon, and I'd like to wish you all a very warm welcome. My name is Tracy Ruddle, for those of you that don't know me, and I work for Birmingham Education Partnership. And as part of my role, I attend Primary Forum. And at the last Primary Forum meeting, there was a great deal of discussion against what primary end-of-year assessment is going to look like at all its key stages and how to move forward this year after such prolonged disruption. I contacted Denise Harris. Many of you will know she's the guru of such things, from services to education, and she has kindly offered to run this webinar this afternoon. We intend to record it so that others can access it at a later date, or if people are slightly late signing in, they can always just watch the beginning part again. We are asking you to use the Q&A box for questions and comments, and I will work with Denise to get these answered either in the session today or at a later date. So with no further ado, Denise, if you'd like to pop your camera on, it's great to welcome you, and I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and thank you for hosting this meeting for us. As you can imagine, we've had many conversations around what might happen for statutory assessment, and in many ways that's not our decision to make. So this session this afternoon is about collecting thoughts and suggestions and perhaps defining a way forward for us in our city. So I'm sure that, like me, you were very relieved when the announcement came out, and we were very clear, or as clear as we could be at the time, about what was happening in terms of primary assessment in general. And so we know that on a statutory basis, schools do not need to complete any further activities to prepare for the final assessments. So as you know, I'm Denise Harris. I work on behalf of Birmingham Local Authority to manage the statutory assessment duty at Services for Education. And so a lot of our work, particularly in the summer term, is around the statutory assessment. And so we won't be undertaking monitoring or moderation activities on a statutory basis this year. Along with the information that came out from STA was this second paragraph on the screen now, where DfE advised that they know that schools, and we know that you will be continuing to use ongoing assessment, good assessment for learning practice, to inform teaching and learning for our pupils, particularly given that we are working really hard to help the children to make accelerated progress, to get them as close to where they should be or could be by the end of the year. But we know that this isn't necessarily going to happen in this year, and actually it may be a longer term process, and more likely will be a longer term process. So not only in terms of transition, which is what this webinar is about today, but in terms of supporting the writing of reports for parents, etc. DfE highlight particularly the transition from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3, Year 6 to Year 7. And you can see there, they strongly encourage schools to use past test papers for that. But the conversations that I've been having with the BEP and with head teachers and teachers, we're also talking about the transition from early years to Year 1 and from Year 2 to Year 3, and particularly also the transition from infant schools to junior schools, because we have got a small group of infant and junior schools still within the city. So that announcement was made around Christmas time and confirmed, and it came as quite a relief in many ways. This week we had another document that came out. I'm sure you've probably seen it, but also there was an article in the TES that I read yesterday, and that just picked up some key points from that, and I've just picked up the tension really that has been part of the conversations that we've been having. And it's this idea that the curriculum needs to remain broad and ambitious for our pupils, and we need to maintain the teaching and learning as we'd expect. But on the other hand, you know, our children are going to be transitioning from one key stage to the next. And so while we're being asked to prioritise and identify those gaps to establish that good progress, we also need to be knowing where our children are. So what STA have said to us, and as I say, particularly for Key Stage 2, but also for Key Stage 1 and early years, is that we might choose to use the past test papers. And so what we're asking today really is, should we seek a whole city approach to the end of Key Stage summative assessments to inform transition? And if that's the case, how might we go about that? So on gov.uk, you'll be very aware that we've got a suite of past test papers, and I've just picked out the Key Stage 2 sample here because that's where the main focus of conversation seems to be. So we've got from 2017 through to 2019 test materials, so the test papers, the mark schemes, the scaled score guidance and all of that thing, which we might choose to use. The other thing that's come up in conversation is, well, do we have to use past test papers, past papers? And perhaps we don't. So somebody suggested perhaps we use the PERA or the PUMA tests, so the reading and the mathematics tests that are available. They're standardised in a way that you'd expect them to be. Somebody asked me about, is there any online tests that might relieve the workload for teachers marking? And I work very closely with colleagues in the West Midlands through my membership of IA, and I've asked the question there, and so far nobody has identified an online paper that will do the marking job for us. So we've got some conversations to have really, because part of what we did last year was to submit an on-track standard to our colleagues in Key Stage 3 in the secondary schools. Whereas this year, there seems to be much more of an appetite to have an honest assessment, so that really we can continue that progress beyond the current year group into the next key stage and year group, so that we can hit the ground running in terms of accelerating the progress that our children could make. So we've got some conversations to be had and some thoughts really to share. So we thought about the use of past test papers, and quite obviously they're going to be for reading and mathematics. I'll talk about writing moderation a little bit later towards the end of the session today. And so one of the questions, if we choose to use past SATs papers, or any other assessment test paper, are we going to agree on a common paper, so 2017, 2018 or 2019 for all the subjects, for reading and for mathematics, or are we going to have a diet of different years? Or are we going to suggest to schools that they choose the least familiar paper for their pupils according to the individual schools, and that the use of past papers, not least in assessing the children through using questions through the routine teaching and learning or assessment opportunities. One of my thoughts about using past test papers is we don't have to use them in the way that we have to use them on a statutory basis. So we don't necessarily have to time those papers, because we know that sometimes the stress of the statutory assessment tests is that they are time limited. And so one of the options we might have this year, or we could have this year, it's up to you, it's up to us as a city, is to provide the children with up to 100% additional time for everybody. And the idea around that is that we can find out what the children can do, rather than, you know, what they can do in a given amount of time. And so this idea of having additional time and limiting it to 100% is that we don't want the children to be sitting all morning or all day to take a test. We want to give them, you know, a valuable amount of time where we know they can finish, and we can finish the test at any time. And so that might have implications, for example, of how you manage the testing of the children in your school. So do you test all the children together, or do you split them into groups where those people who need a lot more additional time can have that without interrupting anybody else? And then the other thing, of course, as we would always consider, so that we neither advantage or disadvantage pupils, is making use of the access arrangements, such as rest breaks and prompters and scribes and all of those kind of things, in the usual kind of way. So although the guidance is suggesting that we do use past test papers to assess our pupils for transition purposes, we've got some flexibility that we can take advantage of, I do think. So one of the options might be that we maintain the May test window. So you will know that originally for this year, the spelling, punctuation and grammar test wasn't going to be applied. And I don't see, and you might agree or you might disagree with me, but I don't see the purpose really of the spelling, punctuation and grammar test, because what we'd want to see from that is the evidence in the writing of the children anyway. Although I know that children enjoy it, and certainly in Birmingham our children do very well in that test. But if we do maintain the test window, why would we want to do that? I imagine it's because we could use the outcomes of that test diagnostically, usefully to have a look at the outcomes for whole classes, whole year groups, groups of children. That's most useful, but perhaps individuals where you feel there's a need. But that will inform the teaching and learning opportunities that come after that, in that run up until the end of the year, probably until about the end of June, certainly probably no longer in terms of pulling an assessment together. So it's got the potential also then to inform an end of year teacher assessment judgment. And again for Key Stage 2, potentially against the teacher assessment frameworks that we used to have for reading and mathematics. So that's one option. So taking the test in May, to use diagnostically and to inform a teacher assessment judgment by the end of the term. The other option might be to delay taking the test a little bit later so that we can have a summative test outcome to inform those transition conversations. That equally could inform a teacher assessment judgment against the teacher assessment frameworks for reading and mathematics. So I think there's a conversation to be had there and some, advice really to be sought from you, but possibilities. So just to remind you, the interim teacher assessment frameworks, which were introduced in 2016, 17 and then 17, 18, were quite simple in that they assess the children against a minimum standard at the expected standard. So the children either met the standard or they didn't. And so this is the mathematics interim teacher assessment framework that you can see here. And of course, alongside that, there were some exemplification materials which just helped us to understand the kind of evidence that would provide the evidence for meeting those standards. As you know, the teacher assessment frameworks are a secure fit standard, so we need to evidence each of the bullet points to say the child is working at the expected standard. And with that kind of information then, perhaps like we used to do, we can rank order the pupils so that we can have our most high achieving pupils through to our lowest achieving pupils. And that information could be usefully passed on then to our secondary colleagues. Similarly, the interim teacher assessment framework for reading is also, and what's available there is the standards as set out by STA to go alongside that. So again, it reads very, very similarly. So just to reiterate, we have got some options, we've got some choices. And so in bringing together some of the conversations that I've been having with the various stakeholders here, one of the comments was something along the lines of, a test is a common currency that we all understand. Everybody's in it together. And actually the outcomes of the test, they're the outcomes, aren't they? And we all understand what they mean. I think, again, a strength of using the test is we have a very similar opportunity for everybody. but we've got some flexibility in the administration of that. So we can make the test work for us in a way that we can't usually. And that works for us as a school, it works for us as teachers, it works for the pupils too. As I said before, it's that opportunity for a diagnostic assessment to inform the teaching and learning priorities. So the earlier we do that, the more we can make use of that in the longer term. Using the tests or even the teacher assessment, actually, it brings together that end of key stage closure, doesn't it? And for our pupils, it almost seems like that rite of passage for year 6, doesn't it? The children have worked hard over the longer term and they're expecting to be tested, perhaps not so much this year as they were last year. And actually, I know that some children were very disappointed that they couldn't take their tests last year. I think the key for me, whether we use the test information or tests informing a teacher assessment, or even just a teacher assessment, we will get some realistic and informative transition data, really giving us the opportunity to talk to our colleagues in the next year groups about what the children can do and therefore enable us to move on and accelerate the progress from that point. So it offers us a robust baseline for the next phase for the teacher to build upon. And of course, it gives us some information to provide to parents through that annual report, which of course is still a statutory expectation made clear by DfE in their information shared with us. There are some challenges. And not least this idea of making the best use of the teaching time that we've got left. You don't need me to tell you that children have been out of school for a long time now, very variable, you know, those children of key workers, the bubbles that have had to shield for a couple of weeks, to isolate for a couple of weeks and then come back. My own granddaughter has had to isolate 3 times already this year. So it's impacting, isn't it, on that? The challenges around the use of tests is that we do have to prepare our children to take the tests. There are skills associated with tests, managing the time, leaving the questions that perhaps on the face of it seem more difficult, moving on and then coming back, checking to make sure that you've answered as many questions as you can, and all of those kind of things. So what's the impact of preparing the pupils to take the tests compared to maximising the teaching and learning and those progress opportunities? Of course, with any testing, it ties up additional staff to administer the tests and to support the tests. So the readers where it's appropriate, people who are just, you know, monitoring for the children who put their hands up to have a question read, and all of those kind of things. One of the biggest things that certainly we've talked about is being conscious of workload and the enormity of the workload, particularly at Key Stage 2, I think, and particularly in terms of, you know, ensuring that we're all understanding the mark schemes in the same kind of way. The workload associated with that can be quite enormous. And so we need to think about teachers' workload there. We also don't know to what extent we're going to have to continue blended learning. We're looking forward in many, many ways to March the 8th, but we still don't know what might happen after that. We still don't know about the extent to which our pupils might be off school, isolating, or teachers might be off isolating or suffering with COVID, God forbid, hope not. But, you know, realistically, there are so many unknowns even now. So, you know, if we can come up with a whole city approach, at least we've got a common framework to work with and to do the best that we can in this situation. I think one of the other challenges, perhaps for our secondary colleagues, is that there's potentially and probably a delayed sharing of transition data so that we can maximise what we can do in primary in order to move on in secondary. And the same with our infant to junior schools too. Okay, I've shared with you a few of the conversations and the thoughts that we've had in those conversations. I can see that we've got some questions, so we're going to pause for a bit of thought and take some questions. I can't promise that I can answer them. It really isn't about me and my thoughts, it's about us. We're in this together, and to work together will be a fabulous opportunity, I think.
Brilliant. Denise, thank you. And the whole time you've been talking, questions have been, and comments have been piling in. And so I'm going to try and put them to you, or explain what people have been saying. So when you were discussing whether or not we should be doing diagnostic testing in May, Rob was talking about the fact that actually diagnostic testing will need to be done earlier than May, that May will be too late. And that he is saying that he feels that the end of June, July for final tests, assessments, whatever people choose to use, might be more appropriate.
Absolutely, absolutely. As I said, you know, we're just sharing ideas from the conversations based on what we know. But absolutely, if you wanted to do a diagnostic before May, you know, we're thinking it's not that many weeks before Easter. There may be some settling in time, and again it's this tension, isn't it, the children coming back and well-being and everything else, but also keeping the teaching and learning going. So absolutely, Rob, thank you. And again, it's a conversation to have.
Great. And Jill has made the comment, which I think lots of people were thinking anyway, that the May week this time was going to be massively problematic because of Eid and Ramadan. And so therefore it could disadvantage children even further if we still keep to that timeline, which I think, I don't know about you, Denise, is a fair comment.
Absolutely, I would agree.
I'm going to say Janet, I hope it is, but I've got a name here that says, if we're testing the children, would the children then have to be informed if they had met or not met the standard, or is this for transition information only?
But that's an interesting question, isn't it? Because the children, in my experience, want to know how well they've done in a test. And it depends how we're going to use the tests, doesn't it? So whether we're going to report a test outcome or whether we're going to use that test to inform a teacher assessment judgment, really. But the world is our oyster. We can make these decisions either together or as schools.
That's really helpful. I think, I mean, I hope it is, Janet. I'm so sorry if it's not. But what Janet's saying is that she thinks this year in particular, this may not be good for mental health and well-being for a child to hear that they haven't. Anyway, that's I'll follow up on that as more come through. Lorna talks about June being a much better option because of Eid and fasting, etc. So that's been picked up. Then I've got someone else who's talking about the fact that 100% additional time will not give a realistic or informed assessment. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure in what way you mean that it won't give a realistic assessment. Is it because you feel that the test should be administered in the usual way? Or I'm not quite sure, Tracy, what is meant by that.
Okay, so I'm sorry because I've only got an initial here, but if someone would just put a bit more commentary around that, I promise I'll come back to it. Jane talked about that she was talking about the fact that we got a common transfer form last year to be used between EYFS and year 1, Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 1 and 2, and then Key Stage 2 and 3. And that, you know, primaries are very keen that all secondaries use this form and don't start sending out other forms. But I think what I've just picked up as well from what you're saying, if schools choose not to test until the end of June, or sorry, assess, I don't want to put ideas into anybody's head. If schools choose not to do it, in other words, maximize teaching time until, so making assessments late June, early July, that is going to have an impact on our secondary schools because data won't be coming to them. I know, Denise, that you and I were also, and I'm just going to throw this in, you and I also had a discussion about, do we actually need to make the judgments at all for EYFS into Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 1 into Key Stage 2, or might it be better if those at the end of the key stages are maximising learning and then some baselining is done as they move through into year 3 or year 1? I just don't know whether you wanted to comment on those thoughts, Denise.
It's interesting, Tracy, because after we'd had that conversation, I met with my colleagues that do my role in other authorities in the West Midlands, and they were actually quite surprised by that suggestion. The kind of consensus was that they would want to do the whatever assessment at the end of foundation stage or key stage 1. So it's interesting, but you know what? The option is there, isn't it, really? However we choose to do, whatever works for us, because I know one of the things that we said in conversation, was to use the key stage 1 year 2 tests in year 3. Perhaps not in September, but towards the end of the autumn term or mid to end of autumn term. But again, it's a conversation, isn't it, to have?
Yeah. Thank you.
Tracy, just going back to the CTF file, I have got a slide coming up with that on, because again, it's a conversation we've had. And I've also asked the question of the local authority data team about collection of data, because one of the other things I spoke with my colleagues from across the West Midlands about was the collection of data by local authorities. And some local authorities are going to collect the data from their schools on a voluntary basis. Now, there's no sense of that happening in Birmingham yet, but it's an option. So the CTF files, I agree. I think it's useful, isn't it, where secondary schools all use the same file. But
makes it a lot easier for our primary colleagues if they're filling in the same thing. I've just got a note here just saying, if you're putting stuff in chat, I'm only following the Q&A bits. So I mean, by all means, if it's just chat, that's fine. But if you want it to come out, if you could use the Q&A, my eyesight is too poor to be able to manage too many things at once. Gaynor talked about moderation, and she thought it would be more sympathetic to pupils for their mental health and well-being. And she could see no reason why teachers can't assess and moderate well, and why moderation couldn't take place across schools.
No reason why not, really. Absolutely, moderation can easily take a place across schools. There's lots of communities already set up for that. That's absolutely, yeah.
And here I've got, we've got one challenge presented by doing the test, is that many children will have done old papers already and have them marked either in school or with private tutors, which for some of our schools, that is also accessed. And they often remember the answers. So when schools are thinking about whether to use past papers or not, that might be an issue for them to think about.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, we very regularly, don't we, use past papers for very obvious and proper reasons. And so if we choose to use past papers, it's got to be that choice of the least familiar. But yeah, there's no, they're in the public domain. Tutors can use them, and yeah, it is what it is.
And then Claire has talked about, labelling children. She's picking up on Janet. Janet, I'm so glad you've told me it is you. That makes me feel so much better. But Claire is kind of coming on the back of Janet's point about saying that, to label children as not having met the standard just would feel awful, as it's bad enough at the best of times.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a common... It's a common language, isn't it? It's how we couch that language with our children, really, isn't it? How we report that to them. Yeah, we've got to be sensitive to it.
Yeah. And someone else here has said about, can schools and consortium make individual decisions, or do we have to undertake a citywide approach? And there is nobody, I mean, I can answer this from Denise. We are not going to suggest a citywide approach to anybody, unless enough head teachers start saying, would it be more sensible if? But I think it is absolutely schools, consortia. It is nothing to do with anybody else. It's only if it makes best sense to the schools in Birmingham And then my role in BEP would be to try and help do something about that. But there are no, I mean, it sounds like very hard work, and I'm not sure I'd enjoy the job very much. But, you know, nevertheless, I think the issue really is ensuring that your secondary, I mean, many of you feed into lots of secondary schools, but that the secondary schools understand the mechanism you've used to make your assessments. I think that strikes me as being the most important thing. I mean, we've got quite a lot of secondary colleagues in on this meeting today so that they understand the complexity of what we're talking about, because they need to understand how these assessments have been formulated and how are they reliable and how might they not be reliable. So things around that. This is Butterfly 1999, sounds nice name. In terms of appropriate target setting for secondary schools, we need some standardized testing to enable accurate target setting. Denise, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because the raw score or the standardized score or the scaled score doesn't necessarily give us any information, does it? It kind of tells us where the children are in terms of something that's very basic, really. Whereas if we were to use the frameworks, for example, we could get some very detailed information about where the children are in terms of some key areas of reading and mathematics and writing.
Great. I mean, I know, Denise, this was only a pause in the conversation, but I think it's worth following up on some of these questions now. So I've got someone here who's saying a citywide plan might be useful, but they think that maybe we should just produce a set of guidance rather than a restrictive criteria, which will allow schools to flex and work in their own way and their own timings. You know, I mean, so we might put a data must be submitted within a time window rather than on a specific date to secondary schools.
Fully agree, really. I think we've got to work with schools and it's got to work for schools. And so a set of guidance might be very appropriate. Yeah.
Yeah. And someone here saying the key for all children is consistency with whichever option we choose so that we don't disadvantage children as they move into secondary.
That's always my concern, is we don't want to advantage or disadvantage our pupils. We want to be fair to them, which is, you know, going back to that idea of extending the time for the tests. It's taking away that pressure of a time limit to allow the children to show what they can do without that added pressure. So, yeah.
Yeah, and then just picking up on another comment here, you know, there's something here about, you know, it would be really hard to do it as a uniform set of SATs papers for the city because, you know, they will just have been used. And I think we kind of understand that that is the case. Greg is saying that taking the test later in the year is worthwhile as it will allow greater opportunity to engage children in learning. A test result would be useful. Would it be useful to send a QLA alongside this result as well, so that secondary schools have more precise information about the gaps and the existing knowledge rather than a standardized score?
It would be useful because, yes, obviously in terms of the test, it's a snapshot. And SDA have said for a long time, tests are a snapshot. They don't give us a very big or very broad picture even of what the children can do. Again, it's that tension between workload for our primary teachers and the value. So if I suppose ultimately what we want to do is produce something that's valuable and valued, because if it's not valuable and valued, it's a waste of our time doing it. We'd be better to focus on the teaching and learning. So if we can agree what's going to be valuable and valued, then we've got a good way forward, I think.
Great. And Sharon's coming here. You know, you talked about the fact that you might let all children have longer to do the papers and have breaks and that type of thing. And she's saying that she feels that quite often is what impacts anyway. And that would be helpful for children in her school, she feels. Then the other comment is, you know, I mean, we're going to all this trouble to produce accurate data for secondaries, but you know, if they're going to baseline again in September, generally, how much do they use the data? So getting a feel for what maybe secondary colleagues do want of us is something important that we might ask the question of them.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we had this conversation last year as part of the Transition Working Party. And it seems that, you know, one of the key things that secondary colleagues wanted was to know how to group the children in the secondary setting. But also, I think last year there was an agreement with our secondary colleagues that they wouldn't be testing the children in September upon their return. So it may be we have conversations like that again, Tracy.
And there's a question here from Claire, who's saying, do secondary schools receive results before the 8th of July normally? They quite often have collected quite a lot of data before that, Claire. They get the actual SATs results then, but quite often they have requested, sometimes as early as straight after half term in May. And I don't think schools, primaries, are going to be in the position to do that this year. People are, I mean, again, it's the same type of thing, Denise. People are just saying really reluctant to use time preparing kids for tests when they just need to get learning.
I understand that completely.
Yeah. Shall we carry on? And I will pick up some more questions if you haven't answered them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's not a lot to go now, just a couple more slides really, with just to inform you about the local authority approach. So as I said at the beginning, we work on behalf of Birmingham Local Authority to deliver the statutory assessment duty, but of course the statutory element has gone this year. But what Lisa Fraser from Birmingham has agreed to is that they will continue to fund some moderation within the local authority. And prior to this meeting, I had a conversation around where the priorities are really. And I know the priority in terms of this webinar have been around the transition from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3. So the current conversation is, you know, do we offer some funded moderation perhaps for those schools who would have been in the assessment cycle this year and last year, perhaps for those schools who are, you know, requiring moderation because they're in category or something like that. Should we offer it to just our Key Stage 2 Year 6 children, teachers? Or do we offer it to early years, Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2? So that's an ongoing conversation that we're having at the moment. And obviously those written agreements that we have with our academies, free schools and independent schools, we can offer the optional moderation by invitation also for that too. We are still offering at Services for Education moderation in the usual May-June window. Again, early years, it's moderated against the early learning goals and we use a best fit model for that. And so the current plan, although this isn't set in stone, is that any early years funded by the local authority moderation will possibly take place in May because of the best fit approach and because of the opportunity then to generate the additional opportunities and evidence related to that. And like the Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, that'll be facilitated by accredited pool moderators. Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, we'd be looking at the teacher assessment frameworks. So Key Stage 1, reading, writing and maths. Key Stage 2, writing. Maybe there's some appetite for looking at the teacher assessment frameworks at Key Stage 2 for reading and mathematics. That's for you to decide. It's not anything that we've got in place at the minute at all. But obviously, in terms of passing on robust data to our secondary colleagues in particular, or from year 2 to year 3, Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 2, the teacher assessment frameworks do use a secure fit model. So we have to evidence all the pupil can statements against the working towards the expected or the greater depth standards. And what the teacher assessment frameworks do is provide a minimum standard. Again, it's based on evidence that's built up over time and context within a subject and across the curriculum. But again, what it will do is provide that common baseline, which very easily, if that's what we choose to use, would be a conversation or some information that could be passed on in terms of curriculum strengths and areas for development. Our current thinking would be for Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, we'd do this funded moderation in June, and we'd use the kind of centre-based peer moderation approach, again led by accredited STA pool moderators for us. Okay, so again, that's something to think about and something we're talking about with the local authority currently. There are also some wider issues, and again, I've already alluded to this, that in some authorities I know that the local authority is going to collect the data from their schools, and there's a kind of payoff to that in terms of what the data then feeds back to the schools as a result of the data collection. I also know that in the documentation that came out yesterday, there's a section on accountability and data and things like that, which I'm trying to tease out with Shagufta from the local authority data team as to what actually it is that DFE are wanting us to collect, particularly at Key Stage 2. At the moment, I can only get my head around the attendance data. And like we were talking about earlier, this question about the common transfer file that was agreed and used last year, the question is, will it be useful again to use this year? And so really that just brings to a close my contribution to the webinar. I am very, very happy to have conversations with you either by phone or by email and to share your thoughts. Obviously, there's work to do perhaps with the local authority and Lisa and Tracy and the BEP, and together with you as leaders of learning in your schools and, you know, being at the chalk face, how we can bring this together to work for us all. You know, whatever form that takes or doesn't take is completely over to you. From our perspective, we know that the statutory element of this has gone, and we know that we've got some flexibilities that we think would be useful to use, but really that's up to you. So Tracy, if there are any more questions, I'm happy to talk to you about those.
Thank you, Denise. Yeah, so we're now up to a further 35. Some are questions, some are comments. But picking up where we left off, there was a comment here that additional time would show what children can do, or rather than how well they manage their time, which is often the case at the moment and is very similar to Key Stage 1 anyway. Alex talks about that this will depend on the quality of many things, the quality of online work, the engagement in online learning. By using a past paper, this will allow us to get a clear picture of progress or lack of it, but give us a good overview. And also that workload isn't an issue, as Year 6 teachers are used to doing that type of practice work anyway. So a comment from them. Sharon talks about, she thinks it needs to be consistent for secondary schools to know that we're all basing our assessments on the same criteria. You can see how difficult this is, can't you, everyone? Because there's such polarized views around this. Not sure, to be honest, if testing is the best way, and how they might feel if they're perceived to have failed. But realistically, many children would not meet the pass mark due to the amount of time that they've missed, but wouldn't necessarily mean they failed. So comment from there. Alex talks about, we know that there will be gaps and children that are behind. This will depend on many things. Oh, that's it. I've answered that one. I'm sorry. Picking up again, a comment from a colleague. From a secondary transition point of view, it would be better if the assessment was consistent rather than comparing a variety of assessments. And I think we can all see why our secondary colleagues would prefer something like that in the past. Someone else has talked about if we were to use a test to summatively rank the children either in May or June, would expected standards still be at the same threshold? Or would Birmingham collate the data and create a Birmingham standard in the same way that the STA does each year? Denise?
Gosh, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because obviously the tests are standardised, and year on year, although the raw score to scaled score mark can change, it's standardised around the level of difficulty, if you like, of the test. I think sometimes it's about accepting that our children aren't necessarily going to be where we would like them to be or where they ought to be, and recognising also that we're not going to make that catch up within this year or even maybe over the next year. And I think part of the conversation that we've been having is about that honest data. And so maybe in feeding back to our children, perhaps we just report the score, the raw score, or the scaled score, maybe just the raw score, thinking on my feet here, so that they just get a score which doesn't indicate whether they've met the standard or not. But I think the way that we couch our feedback to the children in terms of outcomes is crucial, really. And it's not about failure, it's about where they are and how we can move them on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Denise. I mean, I'm just going to read out just a few kind of comments as we're going through. People are talking about if we all do the same thing, there's an element of fairness to that because children are going to so many different schools. You know, and could the government not create, or couldn't the government create some assessments that we could use to try and measure some progress? I imagine that would get, I don't know what type of response that would get from everybody.
I think we can do it. I know we can do it.
Yeah. Helena's talking about, or Helena, the government has removed SATs this year as they know it's not going to be accurate. So we must not overtest pupils. A combination of relaxed informal testing alongside meaningful observation, moderation and small group tasks might allow us to have the evidence without falling back on the security blanket of testing alone.
You know, I think you've captured exactly the kind of process that we want, really. We don't want to be testing children frequently. You know, we just want a test that, if we choose to use it, that's indicative of what the children can do. And we want to give them the most relaxed experience that we can.
Yeah, and Emma's saying, you know, if their school decides to use the test, would we need to alter the pass mark? Should it be lowered to take into account the missing learning? What's your advice on that?
I don't think we can, actually, because we want to assess against a national standard, and that's the benchmark, really. So for our colleagues, whether it's our secondary colleagues or our year 3 colleagues or our year 1 colleagues, we'll understand then what they've got to do along this learning journey. So if we alter the pass mark and we say the children are at the expected standard because we've reduced the pass mark, then actually we're setting our own standard rather than applying a national standard, which is pretty meaningless then, I think, to our colleagues that take them forward.
Great, thank you, Denise. There's someone else here suggesting we could send secondary schools an individual pupil profile type template to support transition, character, behaviour, academic next steps, something like that. It's almost similar to kind of what you might send home to parents as an end of year report. So that was a commentary on that. Melanie talks about it's difficult to be consistent. The schools across the city will not have covered the same content or even have the same amount of time in school. We know some schools have had bubbles burst so many times that, you know, so Melanie's making that point. Jane from Arc St Albans is talking about the secondary colleagues will need to know how the levels, in inverted commas, were decided for students from their feeder schools. For example, if one school allowed 100% more time and another stuck to the official time, the levels for the children would not be comparable.
They wouldn't, and I think, I don't know why you would want to administer the test under the normal circumstances. I think, you know, let's be fair to our children and let's give them the best opportunity that they can, because we know that some of our learners don't necessarily show their best in a test because of the stresses and the time limitations and all of that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Leslie's talking about, have we discussed with our secondary colleagues and what do they want? And I think that is an important point, but I think what was very important to us was that, and that's why I'm so delighted there are secondary colleagues absorbing this here, because it was important for secondaries to realise just what primaries will or think they should or shouldn't be doing. So I think while it's important to ask secondaries what they would like, I think what they would want and what they might get might look very different. So I think we just need to, this is about opening up the debate about what do we do next, really. Melanie's talked about, I don't know, yeah, teacher assessments can easily give secondaries grouping information. Jane's talking about the consistency, she's talking about the consistency across primaries. Claire, you're talking about not standardized results, though I can't remember now what that comment came to. Somebody else is suggesting here, rather than ask secondaries not to baseline, a bit going back to that, should we use assessments? Why not ask them to baseline?
Instead of making an assessment at the end of the key stage?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things that came out last year was the feeling of pupils of not finishing off. I know it's, well, fingers crossed it's going to be slightly different this year in that they will be in school, but it's almost, as I said, that rite of passage came up last year quite a lot. But you know what? It's a conversation to be had.
Going through, Shivana's talking about we could use tests in conjunction with teacher assessments on classwork. A past paper as a final test paper doesn't prove anything. Janet's saying, teachers need time to be with the children again and re-establish relationships. There are some children still in bed when schools ring at 11 a.m. and they get, just the school day is going to be problematic enough. Aaron is saying, do you think that by testing this year, it may inform the school of the impact of lockdowns and that this knowledge could be used to plan next year's cohort?
It's really interesting, that question, because right from the beginning, DFE was saying to us, plan as if these are going to happen, have a plan B. So we'd all got our plan Bs and what have you. And I was very surprised when they abandoned the tests in many ways, because I wondered whether they might use it to inform, the learning loss, the extent of the learning loss across the country. So yeah, it's an interesting idea, isn't it? And interesting for you as schools, really, in terms of what's happened. Yeah. And
then, there was the first statement. This is a comment that's been made, really. So just so that you can clarify it, I think, Denise, is what's needed. The first statement you started with today, that there's no LA moderation or monitoring, and now it's being offered in inverted commas. And the impact that might have on workload and senior leaders' mental health and well-being and work-life balance. So can you just clarify for everyone that particular offer?
Absolutely. There is no moderation on a statutory basis, but our conversation with the local authority was, what can we offer to schools to support schools? An opt-in moderation process is something that's on offer, and quite genuinely, it's on offer. It's not a requirement at all.
Great. I think that cleared that up. So yes, I've got here, only if elected by the individual schools. Yes. Yeah. Simon's talking about his schools, his primary mainly serves secondary outside of the city, so Solihull and Worcestershire, and so he feels that that he wants to use the teaching time available and leave summative assessment until as late as possible.
Yeah, and I don't know why you wouldn't, really, because the teaching and learning is the most important, and you'll be doing the teaching, learning and assessment in the way that you always do. So you'll be gathering lots and lots of information, which, just like we do in early years and Key Stage 1, can be very easily collated in some way.
Excellent. And we've got some comments here about the CTF again, about when secondary schools would require it. And I think that is a conversation that primary forum and secondary forum need to have, as to actually when can it be. And I know it won't have impacted on our primary colleagues, but you know, the outcomes of the off-qual consultation came out just recently, and they were very clear that these assessments were to take place as late as possible in the summer term. And I think if that's what Ofqual are saying about GCSEs, I think it's fair enough for us to be able to say that the same would need to take place as far away as possible to give you maximum teaching time.
Yeah, Tracy, I've had this conversation with Shagufta from the local authority data team, and we were trying to unpick what the guidance is around that. And we understand there's no statutory guidance around the date. It's usually around about the 13th of July, something like that, the deadline for that, but that's not set in stone. So yeah, there's some flexibility around that.
Great. And you know, Janet again is making the point that, you know, if more bubbles might burst, more children might have time off. As we feed into so many secondary schools, consistency should be as good as it can. This is off Claire, to ensure that colleagues know robustly who is at ARE in greater depth, and particularly likes the idea of non-time tests as late as possible. And then I'm just picking up a few more now. Yeah, I think everybody's saying here that actually it's just going to be too difficult for everyone to assess it in exactly the same way. So someone, and this is very interesting, I haven't read it all the way through, Denise, so forgive me because I'm kind of talking as well as reading. Sorry if this is not the forum to raise this concern, but it relates to assessment 21-22 and beyond. But as a year 6 teacher, my biggest fear is that children have missed so much learning that if the thresholds and expectations stay exactly the same, and without an open understanding that children will not be where we want them to be for a while, then it's going to put huge pressures on and become unrealistic. What are your thoughts on that, Denise?
The indications are that statutory assessment will continue as normal next year, and I really don't believe that the standard will be lowered. I don't know. Yeah, because as I said before, we've got this national standard which we aspire to, or DFE STA aspire to for our children as we do. So I don't know. Certainly I'm not aware of any conversations around lowering that.
I don't think that was music to the ears of many people in this room, Denise, but nevertheless, we hear what you're saying. Alex making the point that we're assuming children have gone backwards, but they may not all have done. And that let's measure if they have and by how much in comparison to previous cohorts without the normal pressure, and the data will be useful. But he's saying that, you know, many pupils might like to know how they're comparing and making that point. And Helena is talking about, you know, that year 6-7 transition needs to be amazing this year. They're very anxious. The year 6 children are very anxious, and she'd love to work with her local secondaries on that. And Sharon's saying we need to alter the transition form because, yeah, she's completely right, because working towards expected and greater depth won't work this year. So Janet, if we do agree to it, just remind me that I promised you I'd look at that. Yeah, someone here is saying that the current year 7s didn't have the rite of passage of SATs and they seem to have survived. Again, it's pointless to test if it's not going to be consistent, because the secondaries will be reassessing or just ignoring the data. 100% extra time and difference isn't accurate as it won't reflect future testing conditions. So there's a whole load of stuff on that. Jane Welsh is saying information that year 6 primary teachers hold about the children is invaluable to secondary colleagues. The first thing we need to know, and Jane would say this, is who are the children that will definitely require additional reading support at secondary. Knowing if this student also struggles with maths, it is really important to us so we can get a general picture of the child.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, through the statutory process anyway, that conversation, that professional dialogue with teachers who know the children best. And yeah, as much information as we can pass on to our secondary colleagues is valuable, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I'm conscious of the fact that we said this would be about an hour. I'm going to keep going down the questions. I know that some of you have now dropped out because, you know, I quite understand the pressures on all of your times. I'm going to just pick up a few more as we go through. You know, it would be interesting to see how other countries are tackling the issue of assessment and grading. Do you know anything about that, Denise?
You know, I don't actually know. Sorry.
Someone here who's saying the key is consistency of measuring progress, identifying gaps, identifying what pupils can do, especially at key stage 2 to 3 transition.
I think this focus on what children can do is particularly important, because when we know what they can do, we can move them on from that starting point.
Yeah, and someone here, problematic for transition, e.g. too late to pass on the information to secondary schools. And I think that's something we've just got to kind of think about how that might work. Susan here is talking about from a secondary transition point of view, it would be better if the assessment was consistent rather than comparing a variety of assessments. But Albir is talking about much fairer assessment of what the children can do. I think that's following on from something earlier, Albir, so I'm sorry. Susan's talking about last year for transition, I used the data from assessments, but also met with every feeder school, and we discussed all children with the year 6 teachers. That really helped with the year 7 transition. We discussed what they could do and where they'd yet to meet a target, and it was shared. And this is similar to what Greg had suggested earlier.
Sounds great.
Susan's also talking about, could secondary teachers be involved in year 6 moderation?
Why not? Absolutely. When we send the letters out for moderation, we always suggest at Key Stage 1 to invite the Year 3 teacher, and at Key Stage 2 to invite the Year 7 teachers. So fabulous. Yeah, good. Yeah.
And just here that, you know, there's going to need to be compromise on both sides here between primary and secondary. And again, secondary colleagues would love to work on making sure that the transition is fabulous.
Right.
I think unless anyone has got anything further, there's a few open ones, but I'm not sure what they're following on from, because I think they were a commentary as people were chatting through. Has anyone got anything that they would like to raise before I just take this opportunity to just say thank you to Denise. Denise, I know it's about thoughts and considerations. It's not about answers. If you've got specific questions for Denise, please do email her directly. I will be talking to Primary Forum and getting a feel for what people have thought the way forward, or even if it's just reflecting back out to all the schools in the city, the ways in which different people are going to go about it. I don't think final decisions, this is picking up on something Fleur's saying, I don't think there will be final decisions. I think probably BEP's role here is to reflect out that some schools are doing this, some schools are doing that. I think to me, the issue is making sure that our secondary colleagues understand how our assessments, whatever they are, have been met with, and you know, and most of you have quite rightly talked about children's mental health and well-being, and I actually think staff mental health and well-being as well in all of this. Thank you all. hopefully you found it useful. When you close off this link in a moment, you will get an evaluation, a link to an evaluation. It would be helpful to have feedback. I know this wasn't an answer session. It was never intended to be. But if you could give us feedback on how you think this session went, and it would be nice to know what you think, any comments, any thoughts that you've got about something useful that we could do. I can't guarantee we can do it, but we can try. So Denise, thank you for your wisdom and your thoughts. And thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate your time after a hard week. So thank you, colleagues. And Denise and I will just stay on now until you've gone and you're heading for home or for marking.
Thank you, Tracy.